Welcome to the annual Mark Babyatsky Memorial Lectureship. I'm just going to invite up Dr. Sands, the Burrowby Crone Professor of Medicine, to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks very much, Eric. Yes, I will introduce our speaker this morning in just a little bit, but I want to start by saying a few words about Mark Babyatsky. And I want to thank the Department of Medicine for supporting this occasion. This is now the third year of the annual Mark Babyatsky, MD Memorial Lecture. And it's really gratifying to see so many of Mark's friends, colleagues, and especially his family here today to remember Mark. And I'd like to talk for just a few minutes about Mark and what he really meant to us. Some really basic facts. Mark was really raised in a tough neighborhood in the Bronx, but this never held him back at all. He rose to the top in everything that he did. He attended Bronx High School of Science and then was awarded his bachelor degree from Columbia, and then went on to receive his medical doctorate degree from Albert Einstein and graduated AOA. And then over the ensuing 4 years, he completed his internal medicine residency and his chief residency here at Mount Sinai. Mark's impressive performance in residency was recognized by Dr. Kurt Isselbacher and Daniel Podolsky, who recruited Mark to the GI Fellowship program at the gastrointestinal unit at the Massachusetts General Hospital. And after his fellowship, Mark continued at MGH as a junior faculty member. In 1994, Mark was recruited back to the Division of Gastroenterology at Mount Sinai, and he continued his work in the laboratory studying mechanisms of mucosal repair and inflammatory bowel disease. And while he was successful in the laboratory efforts, he found his true calling and really his passion in teaching and education, and he quickly became one of Mount Sinai's most cherished and distinguished educators. He won numerous teaching awards at all levels of the medical school, and he was known for his mentoring of medical students, residents, fellows, and postdoctoral scientists. And in 2002, Mark became the director of the Internal Medicine Residency Program, co-program director of the Internal Medicine Pediatrics Residency, and vice chairman of Medicine for Education. For the ensuing 8 years, Babs, as he was fondly known, nurtured and promoted the careers of over 400 residents and fellows. His teaching rounds, affectionately known as Babyatsky rounds, were the highlight of the week for all interns and residents who knew they would walk away with clinical pearls and newfound insights into all types of disease. Mark earned a national recognition among internal medicine program directors, becoming founder and director of the Education Research Consortium of Program Directors, and working with the American College of Physicians as a member of the In-Training Examination and Education Research Committee, and as an ACP representative to the NIH and HGRI Genomics Consensus Conference on developing a blueprint for primary care physician education in genomic medicine. In 2010, Mark became chair of the Samuel Bronfman Department of Medicine and professor of medicine at Mount Sinai. And in this capacity, he made an impact on the educational and research missions of the department, as well as on patient safety and quality improvement programs, community and multicultural affairs, and faculty practice operations. In early 2014, he assumed new challenges as the chair of medicine at Monmouth Medical Center and St. Barnabas Medical Group South Region to develop systems for providing high quality and cost-effective care. But this doesn't tell you much about Mark as a person, and he was a very distinctive and memorable person in my mind. He truly had a photographic memory and really retained encyclopedic knowledge not only of medicine but also arts, theater, science, and politics. If you asked him about a particular movie, he had seen it inevitably before you did. He could recount everything about the director, the producer, the actors, what awards were given, and he had also already read the book, by the way. He embodied the keenest doctoring skills, and he really had an innate ability to mentor and guide trainees with an effortless talent for teaching, a really enviable and incredibly accessible body of knowledge for medicine and life. What distinguished Mark from so many other gifted scholars and educators in medicine was truly his caring and compassionate personality, and his genuine interest in every person he met, from student, resident, fellow, to patient, family, or friend. Everyone who knew Mark felt as though they had a unique and close personal connection to him. He made everyone feel valued and important, and whenever you met him, his first words inevitably were, "And how are you?" And this was really heartfelt. he was asking about you and not really concerned about whatever was going on with him, and this was really a heartfelt expression of his concern. He really exuded optimism, always had warm humor and friendliness to people in all walks of life, and in this way, he affected the lives of countless people in perhaps ways that he never really fully know. I know that Mark had a profound impact on me at critical junctures of my life, and I know that I am not alone in that. We're all better for having had Mark among us, and we truly miss him quite a bit. And so now in his memory, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the third annual Mark Babyatsky, MD Lecture, my mentor and colleague and friend, Dr. Daniel Podolsky. Dr. Podolsky is president and Philip O'Brien Montgomery Jr., MD, Distinguished Presidential Chair in Academic Administration, Professor of Internal Medicine, and Doris and Bryan Wildenthal Distinguished Chair in Medical Science at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas. Dr. Podolsky received both his undergraduate degree, summa cum laude, from Harvard College, and his medical doctorate degree, magna cum laude, from Harvard Medical School, followed by medicine residency and gastroenterology fellowship training at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. In 1989, just 7 years on faculty, he became the chief of the gastrointestinal unit at MGH, which under his leadership became legendary as an incubator for leaders in academic gastroenterology across the world. Over the ensuing 19 years at MGH, Dr. Podolsky was exemplary in every aspect of the academic mission. As an investigator, he made seminal observations on the role of growth factors in epithelial restitution, including the discovery of intestinal trefoil factor, which Mark actually also worked on. His hypothesis of the role of integrins in the pathogenesis of IBD led to studies of anti-integrin antibodies in the cotton-top tamarin model of colitis, and this led to the subsequent development of vedolizumab, which is now used to treat many tens of thousands of people with IBD. His renowned skills as an administrator and leader were recognized when he was appointed Chief Academic Officer for Partners Healthcare before he was recruited to UT Southwestern in 2008. Dr. Podolsky has served as editor of gastroenterology, president of the American Gastroenterological Association, and has been awarded the Julius M. Friedenwald Medal, which is the highest award in gastroenterology. Most importantly, perhaps, Dr. Podolsky has mentored dozens of trainees who have since gone on to establish their own successful careers in academic gastroenterology across the nation and the world. Among them, Mark Babyatsky. We are therefore very privileged to hear today from the mentor's mentor, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Podolsky.
Thanks, Bruce, for that really overly generous introduction. It really is my pleasure to be here this morning to celebrate the memory of a colleague and friend, Mark Babyatsky. It's especially meaningful that his wife and sons are here. They should know what a very special man he was. I'm going to start with the obligatory financial disclosure. Given the subject of my talk, I thought it was appropriate to acknowledge that I'm very much a creature of an academic medical center. But before turning to my topic, I do want to go back for a moment to earlier and very happy days at the MGH GI unit. There I am, looking a couple of years younger in the middle, having just become the chief of the GI unit, with a great good fortune that then first-year fellow recruited by my predecessor and mentor, Dr. Isselbacher, who's next to me, gave me that gift in launching my experience as a division chief. 2 years later, Mark had joined the faculty as an instructor, but we also had another gift from Mount Sinai at that point in time, when Bruce had joined as really the first cohort of fellows during my time at the MGH. And I did have the additional pleasure of working with Mark, although his passions, as you heard, carried him into a career of clinical care and clinical education. He certainly dedicated himself with still the kind of rigor to get a foundation in laboratory research, which I have always hoped and believed was a further boon to him in his effectiveness as a clinical educator. So with those remembrances, let me now turn to my topic today. And I thought I could frame it by contrasting the humble roots of UT Southwestern, which you see here. It began as a private medical college, really the product of a group of civic leaders in Dallas who, envisioning Dallas as a future great city, thought that was only possible if you had great medical care, and were enlightened enough to believe that the path to great medical care was through great medical education. And they had more vision than funds at the time, so they borrowed some barracks, affectionately known as the shacks, brought them over to a site in the back of Parkland Hospital, the county's safety net hospital, and the Southwestern Medical College was launched. If I fast forward to last year, our 75th anniversary, you see quite a different picture. The boundary there you see outlines an institution with a number of hospitals, several million square feet of research space, of course, our educational facilities. And in fact, if you were to visit the campus today, you would see 5 more buildings dedicated to our various missions in varying degrees of construction. We're not alone in this kind of growth, and that'll be familiar to you. Picture of Mount Sinai, circa 1920, and a complex that we're here today to, again, reflect what we've seen across the country as a substantial evolution from where medical centers started in the early 20th century to where they are positioned today. And the thesis that I'd like to explore this morning is what changes have evolved along with this growth, and what are its potential perils for the license to operate, which we have enjoyed over many decades in our commitment to the mission of improving the health of the populations we serve. And I can frame this in a question that we ought to have a firm answer to, and I think historically have, but I can tell you, certainly as I have the opportunity to talk not just with colleagues, not just with business leaders in Dallas and other parts of Texas and across the country and in Washington, the answer to this question is not as consistently self-evident as all of us would hope and historically was the case. To put some perspective on this, I realize this will be familiar to many, but I still think it's an important point of orientation that what we see as the academic medical center today was not always what it was expected to be. Our roots, like medical education, today were in the Flexner report. It had obviously its transformational impact on how medical education was organized. But along with that, how that was related to the clinical arena in which that education took place. And in fact, that was seen as the sole purpose for the conjunction between the medical education and clinical care. And with that was the compact that medical schools would remain committed to the people best served, often with what we now call our safety net hospitals, as a investment in eventually having well-trained physicians. We look around today and we see along with that a remarkable research enterprise. It seems for those of us of a certain age as if that was always the case, but in fact that was a relatively late development and a transformational development of the medical centers across the country that really was enabled by the founding of the NIH soon after World War II, and with that steady base for supportive research activities, and even more so, ransoming the time of faculty to carry out research. You saw a transformation to medical centers, which are beginning to look very familiar to us in their present form. Still, the scale of what a medical center undertook as a clinical engine was at a whole lesser scale than what we, at least I will say for myself, take for granted today. And I think it's easy for us to underappreciate how transformational the development of the Medicare program and the Medicaid program back in the 60s, extending care, of course, to those either 65 and above or many of those most vulnerable in our country, suddenly made it possible to see clinical revenue attached with the care of the patients who traditionally had been cared for, going back to that original social compact in the 1920s and 30s. And the rest is history in the making. You see the picture of UT Southwestern. We're no different, in fact, by scale, smaller than many of our peers across the country. And everybody in this room is in the midst of seeing the growth and expansion of academic medical centers. So back to my question, why should the public be concerned about the well-being of academic medical centers? Why should there continue to be societal investments? Well, there is a case to be made that the academic medical centers are delivering on that original social compact. I share with you data that was developed by Ashish Shah at the Harvard School of Public Health, published, as you see here, in JAMA recently. I think it's important to note that this was a study that was supported by the Association of American Medical Colleges. Well, I say that with all due, for all the obvious reasons. But with that disclaimer, or with that caveat, what you do see is some validation of what all of us might have assumed, but certainly couldn't or wouldn't be able to prove. And that is that there actually is improved survival in major teaching hospitals. And I'm using major teaching hospital, obviously, as a surrogate for academic medical centers. And as noted, as modest as some of these changes may appear, given that they apply to tens and hundreds of thousands of patients, actually it's highly meaningful and statistically significant. And so, reassuring that with all the investment, there actually is a contribution, particularly as this reflects the outcomes for patients in the Medicare patient population, I should stipulate. Also, as much as, we may be vulnerable to critique, and I'm making some of that critique this morning, we've not by any means really abandoned that original implied and really explicit commitment to underserved populations. When one looks at the proportion of charity care provided in this country, and the same is true, as you will appreciate if we look more narrowly, or in addition, at Medicaid, the preponderance of that is being provided by our teaching hospitals associated with academic medical center. And while I don't know the specifics for Mount Sinai, I'm sure you exemplify that, as I know we do at UT Southwestern. So still caring for those who might otherwise be unable to get high quality care. And to a degree that it's a surrogate for being the court of last resort. I show you very recent data, again assembled by the Association of American Medical Colleges, that shows that the hospitals associated with academic medical centers are in fact the majority recipients of transfer, that is of patients, that is of individuals who in a community setting or other hospital setting are deemed to need treatments not therefore they're available there, and are transferred to places like Mount Sinai and other academic medical centers. So I would argue that there are data that show that we are continuing to deliver on that collective original expectation. I guess here I should also make a disclaimer that maybe would have been better really up front. I am really pivoting this set of reflections on academic medical centers around the growth of the clinical enterprise. And within the time available, have made the decision that would not also take on the otherwise really important topics of the evolution of our educational enterprise, and as well as the evolution of a research effort that is well matched to the needs of society. But all of those, I think, as everyone in this room will appreciate, are being are being framed within the context of this growing mission that academic medical centers have embraced in expanding the clinical services they provide. So having made, some case, I hope, for the continued delivery on the mission by academic medical centers, I would also say that there are other aspects to this which add to the weight of the answer and the justification to address that question: why should the public care? Why should the public continue to invest? We are the source of the future caregivers, physicians, and others across the spectrum of those needed by a community and a population. We are the one place where the missions of teaching and research are integrated with clinical care on the premise that I think the evidence would support that facilitates all three of those in a synergistic fashion. And certainly, even today, with massive growth in research efforts in the private sector, particularly the for-profit sector, it's noteworthy that it's been estimated that somewhere in excess of 85% of what are categorically new therapeutics have their origins in discoveries made in academic medical centers. And therefore, when you hear about a vedolizumab, for example, in an IBD, other therapeutic advances which has transformed our ability to care for many types of patients, those are genuinely ones we can credit our academic medical centers with. I couldn't get through an entire talk completely abandoning my GI roots, so this is my model of the intestinal stem cell as analogy for academic medical centers generating, instead of absorptive cells and goblet cells, also our clinicians, our investigators, our teachers, and so forth. But as I said, by way of anecdotal impression in my experience, but I would say also supported by some recent survey data, that solid confidence in academic medical centers as being this unique and essential part of the total health ecosystem of the United States is beginning to look frayed. I'll show you here some data about what has happened just in a few years in being less confident that academic medical centers are the source of medical innovation and the latest treatments and cutting-edge technologies. I would say in the same survey, you found many people who, in fact, were a little unsure as to what an academic medical center was and why it would be distinctive. Now, I think the answers for that lack of clarity are rooted in some real confusion as to what these centers are and what their missions are. Historically, as I've tried to touch on, it was pretty clear-cut that we were centers which were dedicated to the education and training of physicians and others, to research and clinical care. But now there are other expectations for us. The technology transfer, and I certainly consider that a very essential expansion of the mission to make sure our discoveries eventually get out and have real-world application. That's part of our institutional mission statement. We are a social safety net, going well beyond having been just a source of care, but for really addressing the constellation of socioeconomic factors which often are associated with poor health and certainly health disparities. We're an employer, we're business, we're important members of the business community as we have grown. So I think some of that, some of the uncertainty, and this is speculation, in interpreting those survey results which I've referenced, depend on what you imagine the elephant looks like based on what your point of reference may be. So let me now shift into the world as I think it is increasingly in our rushing up in our front view. And because I won't surprise anybody in this room by suggesting that we are in a period of, I hesitate when I say this because it always sounds like it might always be true, but I believe it is the case, unprecedented change. The scale of change, the complexity of the change here. But nonetheless, I would root it into the fact that the world has always been changing, as you see the tectonic plates here have been in motion for millions of years. And I consider that one of two certainties which is to say, I also want to give the disclaimer that my crystal ball is not any clearer than those in this room. I'm just having this opportunity and appreciative to do so, to frame, frame the issues as I see them. And there are a lot of forces at play. These will be familiar to you. Certainly technology, we have yet to really fully appreciate how that will enable, transform, challenge our ability to deliver even more effective care. I'm sure Mount Sinai, as do we, have digital strategies, but I'm talking something more profound than that. What eventually the implication of artificial intelligence will be. I saw coming into the building this morning a conference soon to take place here at Mount Sinai. And then there's the organizational, those tectonic plates are shifting. I know less about the New York landscape than I do of Texas, but if New York is like any other part of the country, you're seeing incredible motion in aggregation and disaggregation between physicians, independent, into organized groups, with payers, payers with providers, providers with independents. And what all this means for an academic medical center like Mount Sinai sitting here as a hub, even as you've expanded your system, I think, in my view, if we're honest with ourselves, is very hard to know. And then there's the economic forces. And here, I just want to shape conventional wisdom, which in this case, I think is probably real wisdom, that we have economic factors which are going to make that change no longer at the glacial pace or the geologic pace of those tectonic plates, but really ones which will be exponential in their pace. And which will surprise nobody, that's the cost of the care that is the total cost to our society of the care provided. And even that, as I think all of us in this room would appreciate, leaves us with many outside real access to quality care, with care which is often inconsistent, and certainly great disparities among communities in our populations. But you've been hearing about this for really decades now. I can recall, although don't hold me to the exact temporal link, in the 70s already, when healthcare spending was about 6% of GDP, and when it was going to get 8%, it was like, the world would come crashing down. And then it was going to be 12% and 14%, and we're now at 17 and 18%. So I could understand why somebody of a skeptical mind would say, okay, it didn't happen before, why will it happen? Why is it going to happen? Well, if you really look, you see that the totality of these costs now are really getting to the point of squeezing out the ability as a society, and specifically as a government, to cover all of its entities. The Medicare and the Medicaid bill is now going to exceed those of all our other spending individually. And eventually, that is simply not tolerable. I can't tell you that I know that that will be whether it's 19% or 21%, but at a point where we can no longer meet our obligations to have an adequate defense, to fund Social Security, to carry out other really imports of discretionary spending on education, something will have to change. And the other thing, and again, I know less about it in New York, but I can say we see it in Texas, and to a degree not as much as it is even more prevalent throughout the rest, many other markets in the country. Coverage is shifting for those who do have commercial insurance, so that they have, the patients have much more skin in the game, i.e. that the decisions they make about their health care impact them directly in terms of their payment, as opposed to those who may be paying the premiums for their insurance, their employer. And when you put those two together, I think that's when you can say, if it's not next week, if it's not next month, it's not next year, it's not a generation off. We are very much closer to that transformational switch, which will demand a solution to how we deliver and commit our resources to provide health care to our population. And I think we're vulnerable as academic medical centers by a critique, some of which I've summarized or I've listed here, and some of which sting a little, because I think we if we're honest with ourselves, we know they have validity, and others are which are unfair. Even as many places, ours included, have really put great effort into finding efficiencies, we know there's significant inefficiencies in the expense involved in delivering the quality of care that we provide. And if we're also honest with ourselves, we've not been as really focused on this as we should have been years ago, or we wouldn't, frankly, be as in the same place that we are now. I think perhaps even more concerning, and what does put us at risk of having that license to operate, in getting a yes to that question, why should the public invest, is that we have collectively been resistant to change. We've been able to often rationalize why we shouldn't have to change, and at a certain point, particularly when you get the policymakers, the legislators, who are faced with these difficult decisions of the budget, that becomes an increasingly difficult argument to sustain if it ever was a legitimate one. We have, frankly, resisted in our willingness to document the value that we provide. Those data that I shared with you, as influenced or not as they may be by the funder, were really about the first data that have legitimized the value proposition as we've often made it by assertion. And so these qualities, whether fair or unfair, are shaping the way in which people are increasingly hearing our arguments as various propositions make their way through the legislative process. And I'll come back to that in a few moments. But I think it's important to say we do need to acknowledge that some of the critique is both true and unfair. And that's around some of the inefficiencies. We are the centers which are educating our students and training our residents and fellows. And I think there isn't a person here who doesn't appreciate that there's an inherent inefficiency to that education and that training process that is intrinsic to the nature of who we are. I think we've not done the best we could at making that well understood, and therefore that gets rolled into an indictment, as I put it, for academic medical centers being inefficient in a way that would reflect poor management. It's not poor management that it takes, I will say from experience somewhat long ago, twice as long to do a procedure with a fellow looking over his shoulder than it might take to do it yourself. And yet that's the process by which we have well-trained gastroenterologists and other physicians. But these other forces that I mentioned are still out there, and we're in no way able to insulate ourselves from them. I've mentioned the point about cost shifting to the patient, who, although it's surprising, I think, to most, that hasn't driven more dramatic changes in behavior already. I think to the extent that that is the case, it's because we haven't seen the full impact of how much insurance will move to put the burden of most medical expense directly on the patient. Increasingly, certainly I can say in the Dallas-Fort Worth market, we see large numbers of patients whose coverage, even though it's considered good commercial insurance, is essentially for catastrophic illness. And just about any expense that they're going to otherwise incur, whether it's a screening colonoscopy or really many of the most common reasons why someone would seek care, they're going to be paying that out of pocket. And we are seeing significant changes in behavior as a result, as one would absolutely predict. And in a sense, and I will come to this a little bit later, this is putting risk on the providers. So I'm sure it's the case here, but I can say from experience elsewhere that the way the payers are approaching us, and of course the government is trying to lead the way in this through its Medicare shared savings programs, for example, from the Next Gen program, for other alternative payment models, increasing the risk is being put on the provider. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge which before I conclude, will illustrate can be met, but that's a real challenge for us if you start with the realization as a fact that our costs are at times unavoidably greater than some of the other non-academic providers in a given environment. So our privileged space of AMCs is at risk because of this affordability. And I think we have to also say in a way that's uncomfortable, and partly because we need to hold up the mirror and wonder, is there any truth in it? But I can say that increasingly those arguing for the needs for transformation, reform anyway, in our payment as a country for healthcare, for policies, doubt what is truly the driving motivation of academic medical centers. It's in a way sad to say, but a reality that where once in a time there would have been no question as our academic medical centers and the systems that they develop have expanded, there has been the increasing uncertainty as decisions are made. Is it for the mission or the margin? And while we all hear the cliche that if there's no margin, there's no mission, if the decision is always about the margin, you start to see the dissociation that undermines confidence. I've talked about resistance to change, and really the last point I want to make in terms of framing the diagnosis is the evolution that has made us look increasingly similar in ways that seemed hard to imagine not that long ago with community-based systems. I'm going to skip through that. So I would say increasingly it's a blurry distinction in some ways, partly driven by the need for scale as you talk about population health and accountable care organizations, meaning you need a very, very large primary and secondary base of the pyramid, where what we has historically done in general have been, up in the more complex care that ultimately some of that base of the pyramid will need. But as you are part of that and parcel of that, that's what obviously is being done in our non-academic medical center counterparts. We are not increasingly given the benefit of the doubt for that we deserve special dispensation for different standards of efficiency and value. And in a way, the other, and kind of also turning this on its head, so to speak, our once unique hold on the responsibility for education and training, is becoming more dispersed. We see certainly as there has been expansion of residency programs very recently in many states, actually funded by state support as opposed to the federal government. It's been to drive this residency training out into the community-based practices. And in many cases, I think we would all agree, appropriately so, in terms of the total mix of what we need as a healthcare workforce. But it does mean that you now have less of that as the unique, actually, I'm going to go back to that, as the unique and distinguishing part of the justification for the academic medical center. And I do worry that as we become more and more similar, I can't help but think of the quote from Animal Farm at the very end, where they're looking, Napoleon's looking at what's happened over the course of time. I'm sure most people, if not everybody here, will remember this story, the pigs and the men, and they couldn't tell the two apart. I don't think we're there, but at a certain point we need to make sure that that's not the future that we see, that we have not really walked away from those aspects which are the special purview and the special responsibility of the academic medical centers. But here, in a way, is the crux of the challenge for us, that if it is necessary to grow in a world oriented around population health, it has inevitable impact on the other missions, because our missions are not similarly scalable. And I think as they become increasingly in some institutions grossly disproportionate in the scale of what they do, you get the dyssynchrony of mission. I referred earlier in my comments to this unique ability of academic medical centers to create the synergy between the education and training mission, research, and clinical care. But I think we can look around and see many academic medical centers which are struggling with the fact that the enterprise itself has grown so large that there's not the similar institutional focus and the ability to be sure that that imperative for growth on the clinical side is done in a way which fully incorporates the needs to have a thriving research and educational training commitment. Also, I put that amidst the opportunity cost, whether or not that growth in clinical delivery is engineered in a way which allows the academic medical center to take advantage of that for the new research opportunity it creates in areas like healthcare delivery research, quality and outcomes research. There. So that is all, in a way, diagnosis. I'd like to just spend a few moments on some therapy, at least therapy as I think about it, for our center. And my touchstone here is the is this boat, which you see, is the Vasa. And the Vasa is, you'll find it in a museum in Stockholm, which I highly commend it to you. I was there 6 or 7 years ago, actually on the occasion of one of our faculty, Bruce Beutler, receiving the Nobel Prize, and I highly commend you going to Stockholm for that kind of occasion too. But the Vasa was a ship built, it was a Swedish warship. It was built in 1627 or so. 3 years of construction. It went out about 200 yards from the dock and sunk. It was then discovered 333 years later, taken out from the muck of the harbor, and then it's in this museum. It's really quite fascinating. And there's two things about it that's really struck me. The first is, apparently back then, you just started building the ship. You didn't have a plan. You decided you had the keel, and then you just started building, and you built it until it was done, and you launched it. So not having a plan turned out not to be good. And the other thing that was a cautionary note, the reason it sunk is it was top-heavy. So I thought this is something to keep in mind as we think about what do we do in our thinking about our academic medical centers. And the first thing is to, in thinking about what the plan should be, which to a degree I think will be relevant really at academic medical centers like ours, even if I will, suggest that inevitably there will be, if you will, the idiosyncrasies which are relevant because of special circumstances depending on where you are and geographically, the community, the environment. But there are, I think, a common set of overarching variables that you have to solve for, and what we solve for collectively. It was something that's been noted by many over the last number of years as the baby boomer generation. So I was surprised to figure out that I was part of that generation, but is coming of age, so that 10,000 more are becoming eligible for Medicare. So that's it's not just a matter of how we're being cared for. It's a surrogate to me, but as all of us appreciate, it's as we get older that there's more need for medical care. So the demand for developing care is only going to expand in a very dramatic way. And we're delivering care which is any approach on the collective has to accept the fact there are generational differences in expectations. Certainly we see this in our, and try to respect that in how we think about our curriculum, our training, and our career development, as well as our workforce, for just by way of local example, as well as these other considerations which will be well known to you. So there isn't a static landscape against which we can then be thinking about how do you operate and develop and sustain an academic medical center. But perhaps as important as those, not perhaps, as important are those are what society expects of us. And to a degree that was unnoted as I was growing up, going through medical school and training and early faculty, the notion that we had an obligation for accountability and transparency. And I think any notion that this is going to go away and return to what was an era of kind of hubris and autonomy, I think would not be a premise on which I would plan anything. Expectations for value, access, and at the same time maintaining what was the core that guest brought everybody in this room into medicine, empathy for, for the patients that we care for. There are some short-term strategies that one could take if you're just worried about, well, how do I get my medical center to the next year or a couple of years? You can customize I call these each having a moral hazard to them, customizing the payer mix. The moral hazard there, of course, is that we should be committed to all of those who really, are in need. You can customize your patient base, looking for where do you put your satellite and where you're not, but, that, to me, that becomes a short-term strategy. Eventually, you run out of that to do, and again, it's the moral hazard. Customizing service mix. I can point to another provider in the Dallas market who's been exquisite in somehow having the mix of the most high-margin services, and yet I see them now eroding because people have other needs that they're not interested in supporting, and they find their way. So, I think also it's a short-term strategy because, that kind of populist book, however long ago it was, the cheese will get moved. What is now, revenue centers, eventually those will change in terms of, because Willie Sutton will eventually figure out, when there's a real pressure to find out solutions to our healthcare costs in this country. An international invention, that's my own bugaboo. I think there's so much to do at home. That's where we're staying in terms of serving our own communities. So the therapy is straightforward. I really think our future is secure, as naive as some may find it, really sticking with our mission is. It's when we've deviated from it that we start to erode the case for the support it takes to sustain the inefficiency, so to call it, of training and of research. It's to embrace change where we've resisted it in alternative payment models and leading in value and being able to demonstrate this, which means embracing transparency and accountability. I've already gone through that. So we'll need to get our size right and be sure that when it's growth, there's growth that fits in within the context of what's the totality of it, what it takes to be an academic medical center. This slide is simply to say, every animal has a certain body plan that makes sense for it. You can't have... There's reasons why, you don't have 12-foot human beings and a fly is of a certain size because the parts need to work together in the right balance. And that's something that I think we need to keep in mind as we think about how we're growing the clinical enterprise. And I'm going to acknowledge there will be growth. We have a growing population. But again, not as the sole, not the driving, and certainly not as a sole consideration. And I think there are adaptive strategies which will serve us well collectively, some of which we are pursuing at UT Southwestern. There's ways to grow other than by organic growth, meaning other than to be bigger yourselves. There's ways to, we think, have creative associations that give you the scale without the potentially all-consuming, consuming all of your institutional energy that it takes to run a mega enterprise. Certainly some of our academic vigor is going to be possible only by association with other important disciplines that will enable us to be more effective in the science of healthcare delivery, of healthcare policy and services. I consider one of the most daunting problems is solving the steady state, what I call a steady state puzzle. This goes back to the first bullet point. How do you maintain yourself with, if not zero growth, modest growth, so that the growth doesn't end up being the all-consuming determinant of what you otherwise are doing as an institution. And that requires the development of new competences of process improvement as one obvious example. And it's also to acknowledge that we do need a much more diverse set of phenotypes in our academic medical centers to bring these talents, which historically had not been necessary. So if I was to go back to that slide with the intestinal stem cell, there really should be many, many more cell types, maybe enteroendocrine cells, that would really fit out the vision for the full richness of careers and expertise that we need to be successful. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through those and spend just a couple of minutes thinking it might be a hollow comment without spending a few moments on what we're doing at UT Southwestern. We have made quality our primary business strategy. We do embrace value and risk. And we have grown by ourselves, organic and by association, but have done so with linked investments in academics. And let me just elaborate on a couple of those. We know that we realized a number of years ago, going back to 2016, that although we were at a national average, we could do better in reducing sepsis mortality in our university hospitals. And you see, this is the data going down to what now puts us within the Vizient database, so that's 95% of the academic medical centers in the U.S., somewhere around number 6 in mortality, in overall mortality. So an intense focus on improvement actually can yield great results for it. And it is possible for an academic medical center to achieve value by being disciplined in how you look at your cost structure. This slide has got those blanks. It's kind of like, pictures of people that the police have, but their eyes are blanked out, because those are the names of all of the other hospitals in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And this was a determination done on actually using CMS data on cost and quality, looking at top 20 discharges. And what you see there is UT Southwestern on the right with a red circle. And it's saying we're at the extreme of quality at what is average price. Okay, it's not low price, but it's average price of all these other, not mostly all community-based centers. So I'm not entirely doing it to give ourselves a pat on the back. I guess it's a little bit of that, but just to show it is possible. And actually, I'm especially proud of that other red dot there, which is Parkland Hospital. Parkland is the county hospital. As you might guess, like Bellevue serves a very socioeconomically challenged patients. It is run by the county administration, but all of its physicians are our faculty. So the fact that that next to the university hospital itself, Parkland scores, in essentially at the relative extreme to the others in the quality of the care it provides to these to the patients we serve there is something I'm immensely proud of. This is our approach to growth. This map I'm sure won't be familiar to many. It's not Manhattan. That's Dallas there on the right, or the far side to me in Fort Worth. That the Metroplex, which is kind of around this, is so-called, is a population center of about 7 million people now, growing 1 million people more over the last 8 years, for example. We're in Dallas, but what we have established is a growth by association, a clinically integrated network with Texas Health Resources, which is a community-based system of about 23 hospitals and about 250 access points along with that. And so we have formed this clinically integrated network, which now provides that very broad base of the pyramid beyond our need to endogenously grow a huge primary care base. We serve as the tertiary care, quaternary care, only academic medical center in that. And that is an organization which we launched 3 years ago, in part with a shared commitment to embrace alternative payment methods, such as the Medical Shared Savings Program, which is one of the largest in the country, now in the Next Gen, which is the two-sided risk, more mature program of that, more mature version of that, Medicare Advantage, and again, in the interest of time, I won't belabor it, but to say that this has been the #1 performing ACO in the country in the Medical Shared Savings Program. Cumulative savings actually now of $101 million, $39 million last year in the Next Gen program, and with top decile quality programs. Now, part of this is, one of the secrets to saving money is to be in a high-cost environment. So the bar is not as challenging as it is in, say, Wisconsin or Michigan. But nonetheless, I just want to say that I think you don't have to suspend the laws of gravity for our academic medical centers to live up to those, those environmental challenges, which as I outlined, are going to be inescapable. So this is my second to last slide. It's questions that I find myself musing about, pondering, worrying about in relationship to the overall topic. Probably the top one, as much as anything, you've heard me, use the word growth, many, many times in the last 45 minutes. I think it is one of the great challenges of the day for us in terms of staying true to what we can deliver, should deliver, are expected to deliver as academic medical centers. And I haven't spent as much time on the bottom bullet, but I want to say that's by virtue, not of its lack of importance, but within the limits of time, but it's also as important as it is the top bullet. We need to understand the implication of this for our faculty and our trainees. So I said there was two certainties. One was that the change was going to happen, whether it's geologic speed or what I would argue is a much much more rapidly increasing pace. And the other certainty is there will be ups and downs, but hopefully the road is, directionally is upward over time. So with that, thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much to Dr. Podolsky for that fantastic lecture and very thorough overview of the landscape. We have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks very much for a stimulating lecture. My two comments are about agedness of America and about your predecessor from Brooklyn. So about Brooklyn, it was a long trip for Dr. Selden to leave Brooklyn and get to Texas. But he did a great job from all that I read about. And secondly, we have plenty of people at Sinai from Brooklyn. So we need to give a little more credit beyond the Dodgers to that great borough.
Well, I would say on the first, maybe one of the greatest compliments of my life, be put in the same sense as Don Selden, a giant of medicine who passed away about 2 years ago at the age of 97, really shaped our institution, but I think well beyond it. And yes, he was proud of his Brooklyn roots, but remarkable in his vision. He had been offered a position at Yale, but decided a young man, particularly of his Jewish background, was not going to have the opportunities. He came and he saw those shacks. In fact, he would tell the story many times that when he first arrived, he was looking around for the medical school, couldn't find it, went to the gas station and said, "Where's the medical school?" Quinn, that's it, in the shacks. And you don't have to convince me of Brooklyn, center of the universe, that it is. With my two granddaughters, my son living there, you don't have to persuade me how important it is as a source of talent.
Wonderful lecture. I heard the Vasa story a little different.
All right.
I heard that the boat builders knew exactly how to build that boat, but the king envied another boat and decided to tell them to put an extra layer on top of it that completely destroyed its center of gravity. And I think the reason that resonates with me is to say how important it is to have great leadership. Leadership driven by the mission and integrity, and the mission, as well as leadership driven by the data. And just one comment, I think the future will be in risk, and reason for that is the only way to avoid micromanagement and the dispiriting impact of that on modern medicine is by unleashing the creativity of the physicians, and the only way that'll be achieved is if they in fact do take risks. So that's, I think, why I was very impressed with your ACO data.
So on the first Navaza, I will check my history on the first, but I did make note, and it's sort of what I implied by saying it was top heavy, and I took it as a slightly different cautionary note, which is not too much administration. We'll sink the ship.
So that was great, thank you. You mentioned stuff about millennials, basically. So the 35-year-olds who are graduating from programs now look at this picture, I think, really differently than 60-year-olds, let's say. So is there anything in your treatment plan that sort of attacks that?
Well, part of it is, and I'm sure everybody here, there's a short answer is yes. Part of that is, really understanding, a different set of expectations. Whether that's the often glibly referred to as work-life balance. I think, we clearly are a different set of expectations, and how we coordinate care on the campus is taking into its framing, you know, expectations about how long people are going to work and with what intensity and with what ultimate accountability, and so those are realities. The second part of that is dealing with, you know, the inevitable overlay, and I'm sure there are efforts here around physician burnout and what you do to maintain, you know, the well-being where that really does land. Particularly, part of it is generational, part of it is just the career development. When we've looked carefully, we've done intense surveys of our faculty. You know, where the greatest pressure is felt is in our more junior faculty. They feel less in control of what they're doing, and most especially in our women. And we're doing everything we can to sort of address that, you know, with the recognition that that is impacting job satisfaction and well-being, and ultimately, you know, if I looked at it in the most cold-hearted way, and ultimately productivity. So, you know, and the other, you know, part of it was, I think I listed separately, but it is walled up in that, is the role technology plays in how they do the work, how they see their work. And that's not just, of course, our physicians and other people who are part of our team. It's our patients and everybody else, and what their expectations of us are. So I've just listed you a number of issues. I haven't given you, you know, anything but a down payment on the solutions.
So we want to thank you again for coming to spend some time thinking about Mark. And we also wanted to give you the certificate. I just wanted to read out the bottom here, which it says, a dedicated mentor, clinician, and researcher who embodies the extraordinary leadership, enthusiasm, and humanism of Mark Babyatsky. And so thank you to Dr. Podolsky for spending some time with us, and also to our colleagues, friends, and family of Mark.
Thank you.